Good afternoon. It's indeed a pleasure to be here. Just walking around on the floor at FinTech is incredibly exciting. Just the conversations and the companies and the ideas that are flowing through this conference center are rather startling. And I think it sets a great backdrop for the conversation I'd like to have this afternoon, which is about the future. I wanted to share with you a quote from the beginning from Singapore's first prime minister, which is about change and the constant struggle of change and how you really have to fight to make sure the change you get is the change you want. If you work in information security, if you work in cybersecurity or financial services, this rings true. Our lives are indeed filled with challenge and struggle and trying to adopt the right balance. The world is going through a rather unprecedented change, in my view. I think we are watching an really kind of a never-before-seen diffusion of power and of insecurity, and at the same time, opportunity. What's driving this sort of shift in power, insecurity, and opportunity? Well, in many ways, it is being driven forward by rapid advances in internet connectivity and technological advances that are coming from things like cloud computing. We're starting to see ideas and capital move further and faster than any other point in human history. And that is, to me, wildly exciting. It's also, in the tech industry, we get very excited about that because it's disruptive. But disruption can be dramatic, and at times it can be dangerous. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is ways that we can work together to better understand the opportunities and challenges that lie ahead of us in cyberspace. Sometimes I find that before you can go forward, you have to go backward for a moment. And this strange-looking slide that I'm showing you up here is actually a map of what the world looked like in the year 2005. It probably looks a little different than what you've seen on a traditional map. The size of the square up here indicates the number of people in a country that are online. And the darker the green of the square indicates the higher of the percentage of population of that country that's online. So if you look up here, for example, you see Japan, pretty good sized square, and it's dark green. And you see China, which is, maybe a little bigger than Japan in cyberspace in 2005, but it's yellow, meaning there's a lot of people who are not connected at this point. So it's a simple way to sort of read that. But you think about 2005, it was such a quaint time. Uber was still just a German word, and all of our computers still had definable perimeters. We didn't have iPhones. None of us were on Facebook because it was only a year old, and speaking for myself, I just wasn't cool enough to be on it then. I'm actually still not, but we were in a very different world, and yet we all thought we were super connected. Well, in some ways we were. McKinsey came out with a really interesting report that flagged that 2007 was actually a high mark in international capital flows. This strange world with 1 billion people connected was moving $12.3 trillion around. Wow, that is astounding. Now, what happened after that, many of us know, is the financial crisis kind of changed things. But if you fast forward just a little bit into the future to 2015, which is what this map represents, the world again looks dramatically different. This is a world driven by cloud and by apps on our phones. And if you look at the size of the squares and the saturation, it's also, in my view, changing international geopolitics. I'm one country, I'm one vote, but I represent a massive amount of cyber users. I'm a market. I'm this, I'm that. We are changing things dramatically. This is a slide in many ways about the opportunity that's ahead of us. If you look at it simply this way, think about the mobile payment system in China. In 2012, I think it was, they had about 80 billion in payments that were transacted over mobile payment systems in China. And in 2016, they had 2.9 trillion. Wow. That's a lot of activity going on in that square, and more to come. Who knew about FinTech startups in 2012? In that time, FinTech startups were getting about $12 billion a year. Now, as of 2016, I think KPMG said you're getting about 66 billion moving into FinTech. Really interesting, the dynamics that are happening, especially when you consider the fact that global capital flows actually dropped 65%. We're moving less money around, but more money within countries. So the opportunity of connectivity with inside of countries and shifts in the global market are changing the future. And in some ways, I think they're creating phenomenal opportunities for FinTech, for cloud, and for many other technologies and markets. But something else is also happening. Oh, it's great. We got a lot more people. We got a lot more devices. We also have a lot more regulations coming. There are 90 governments today that are passing cybersecurity laws and regulations. Why is that? Well, at the outset, I mentioned that there's a big diffusion of power, of insecurity, and of opportunity. And this slide of 2015 shows a lot of opportunity, but that shift that's happening in global dynamics also reflects a lot of insecurity between and among governments. People want some assurances, and they're trying to find that in different ways. But it's also a time of continued change. Cloud computing, storage, and compute capabilities are doubling at a rate of almost every 6 months. Again, I find that astounding, but when you look at the rate of growth, you understand it has to be that way. The other thing that's really fascinating is we have more people than ever who are becoming part of the banking community. They're using financial services. Again, this is a diffusion of opportunity and power. A lot of it in emerging markets, some of it in developed markets. I think the one takeaway from all of us, or for all of us, should be the fact that capital may have stopped moving as much internationally, but information almost doubled in that same period. It's a fascinating contrast when you think about it. And data is an asset all its own. In 2014, it was estimated we had about 2.8 trillion. And by 2020, maybe it hits 11 trillion. The world out there is moving forward faster. Data is going to be part of it. FinTech is going to be part of it. But how do we really think we're going to deal with the future trends, and what are they? So I'd like to spend a little bit of time kind of going fast forward. My team has been developing these maps for a couple of years. This is the map we did for the year 2025. This map shows about 5 billion people, 50 billion devices, and a surge in data that's coming. What you can't get from a map like this are what are going to be the impacts of things like AI and machine learning on society and on the international system, and on services like FinTech. I think at the end of the day, we're facing 4 big challenges as we start to look toward the future. Regulatory fragmentation, number 1. Transformative tech, what are the things that we're going to face as we watch certain families of technology move forward? Demographics, because actually demographics impact security and innovation. Who knew? And perhaps the most difficult one to talk about is conflict, and how changes in technology and advances that we're making through digital transformation actually provide opportunities for attackers, and what are the things that we need to think about differently as we're building the next generation of technology. So first of all, I would like to start with regulation. I mentioned earlier that there's like 90 governments around the world writing cybersecurity laws and regulations. Have any of you seen the G20 financial stability report that came out a few weeks ago? So I'm judging by the lack of hands that you all have social lives, which is a very good thing. It's a great report. I don't often admit that I read it, but I am to you. If you flip forward into the executive summary of the report, you'll find that the G20 countries reveal what they're working on. So they did a survey after the last G20 meeting about, what are we actually doing for cybersecurity regulations? And there are 55 different regulatory schemes that are currently out for comment and in development, with more coming. And there are 35 new supervisory schemes that are being developed. Wow, that's a lot. If you are starting to develop tools and technology that you want to use around the world, you're going to wake up and find out that some of the controls that you think work great in 6 countries may not work in another 10 or may not work in 12, because each one of these sometimes gets tweaked by each of the supervisors or regulators in the different countries. It makes it really hard to have a global approach to business. And I think that's one of the things we're going to have to figure out in FinTech and in cloud services and in the future of financial services innovation. How do we try to manage regulation at scale? Is there something we can do to harmonize security baselines so that we at least know we're all kind of working from the same song sheet, and yet at the same time we're challenging each other for continuous security innovation so that we can move forward? There's a huge amount of work to do here. And guess what? It is not going to be solved by lawyers. I love lawyers. I spend a lot of time with lawyers. But some of this is going to happen when regulators meet practitioners and we have real discussions. And today, I don't know that we always have the right international forums to sort of have those discussions in real and meaningful ways. We're going to have to build that together. So, transformative tech. I am probably going to spend the least amount of time on this section, because if you walk up and down the hallways of this conference center, you're going to find all of it out there. Blockchain, AI, cloud. There are some tremendously exciting things happening here. Instead, what I'm going to challenge you to think about are sort of 3 things: security, assurance, and coordination. For security, many of these things are actually amplifiers of security. If you think back to sort of 2013, 2014, everybody was afraid of cloud. Oh my gosh, I don't want to put my data in the cloud. How am I going to trust the cloud? By the time you hit 2016, everybody was like, I have to be in the cloud for competitive reasons. And oh, by the way, there is more security in cloud than I can do myself because it scales differently. But there was also a recognition that you had to manage risks in cloud differently, and you had to build new muscle to do that. And in some ways, I think one of the key lessons learned for me in working with governments in this space was, it's kind of funny. Cloud is a very 21st century technology, and assurance is like an 18th century technology. You get a list of things, and people want a list of paper in a special format that they can put in their desk or they can look at. Where is our real-time assurance? How are we going to build an assurance system for the future that is going to help us with these fast-moving technologies? I want to touch on AI for a moment. AI is super popular. Everybody loves to talk about artificial intelligence. It's funny, because sometimes they think artificial intelligence is like the end of the world. It's deadly, it's dangerous, it's scary, or it's going to solve all of our problems. It is the silver bullet. And the bad news, or the sad news, or the real truth is the answer is probably somewhere in the middle. Citibank released a report that I thought was interesting. It sort of predicted that AI could reduce jobs in financial service by 30%. That's stunning. You think about that, wow. In some ways, that could create new efficiencies, new opportunities, new markets, but that's 30% less jobs. Is that good? Is that bad? But the other thing that comes with AI, people have looked at it in terms of, wow, AI could help us solve supply chain security problems. We could start to understand supply chains in fundamentally different ways. But I think one of the challenges we're going to have to work on in a community is assurance for AI. You think about the example I mentioned earlier about the challenge of assurance in cloud computing because of the speed at which the technology moves and the complexity of the technology. What is your assurance framework for an algorithm? how it was developed, where it was developed, who developed it, what was the ethical framework that came. How are we going to look at that? Are we going to fill out paper in that? Are we going to test that? What will we do to sort of build understanding around what that looks like? Again, I come back to this idea that you'll see throughout the four themes that I'm talking about in the future, and they're all going to require an unprecedented collaboration between technology makers, between policy makers, between regulators, and between end users as we try to figure out how do we shape the world ahead of us. The other thing I wanted to touch on briefly was demographics. So the world is changing. You're seeing all sorts of phenomenal technology move about. But I think one of the most exciting indicators of change and innovation is really what's happening with science, technology, engineering, and math students. If you look at where higher education is going in the developing economies, it's kind of off the charts. About 194 million people pursuing advanced degrees in that space, and we're sort of flatlining in some ways in, quote, developed economies. That's fascinating. It puts pressure on things that you would think are not traditional security issues. Immigration. Countries are competing for talent. I need security talent. Where am I going to get them? Or countries are also and companies are starting to realize, I need this talent because it's coming from a different marketplace. It understands the innovation, the future of new systems differently than I may have thought about them in my traditional constructs. So how are we going to manage this? I think this is perhaps one of the most exciting challenges of our times, and one, again, that we're going to have to work on collaboratively to solve. The last thing I want to spend some time on is talking a little bit about this issue of conflict. I spend a lot of time on this issue, and I'm quite honestly very worried about the state of affairs. Today, according to the National Security Agency in the US, there are somewhere between 30 and 40 countries with offensive capabilities in cyberspace. Okay, that may not sound so shocking. Except that when you really think about what are offensive capabilities in cyberspace, well, they're built generally on IT products, like maybe the ones you make, or the ones we make. It's just that governments don't actually tell us that they're collecting vulnerabilities on our products and trying to figure out how to use them to create national security gains. Well, let's be realistic. It's the 21st century. Governments are going to try to build cyber weapons. They're going to modernize military capabilities. But we have to be really careful about what this looks like in the long run. Today, Microsoft spends about $1 billion on security, and we have about 3,500 security engineers dedicated to our work. Plus, we use cloud to actually help protect ourselves as a company and our customers. But when you start to add up what the spending is for 30 to 40 governments, how much money is that is being spent on offensive capabilities? And when countries buy and collect vulnerabilities and stockpile them, you're actually creating instability over the long term in the international system. That's the system we just looked at in those amazing maps that were filled with opportunity for you and for me and for all those people out there. How do we balance that in a way that is constructive, that understands the need of the modern nation state, but also prioritizes the protections of civilians and consumers in cyberspace? In February, Microsoft came up and released something we called the Digital Geneva Convention. And it was met with really kind of an interesting reception. A lot of my diplomatic friends, kind of furrowed their eyebrow and said, why would you suggest this? We are against treaties and institutions. We believe we should just be voluntary in the work that we do to promote security among countries. Well, that's a good point to be said for that. Like many governments, Microsoft believes that international law applies to cyberspace. The trouble is, many governments engage below the level of armed conflict in cyberspace, and so the rules of war don't apply to them, and they don't apply to us when our products get exploited and attacked and our customers injured. So we have to think differently about how we do that. We're currently talking to other companies about, could we create a meaningful tech accord where industry could come together and kind of draw a bright line in cyberspace that says, hey, if you're a global platform provider, you can't do offense. You can only be 100% defense. And you have to undertake certain measures to make sure that you're patching everybody no matter what's happening. And what about attribution? Is there something more that the private sector could do in attribution that would increase security and accountability in cyberspace? I think there is. I think there's a lot more that we could do. Technical capabilities in this space are growing dramatically. And I think by putting that data out there in a way that governments can consume it and make judgments about it will help improve deterrence. The private sector is never going to replace the government or the government's responsibility in that space, but we could prompt more action and more discussion. And I think that's going to help us keep the flow of data and the flow of capital and the flow of ideas moving. We are at such an important point in time that we have to find new partnerships, new ways forward as we sort of navigate the regulatory changes that are facing us, the transformation in technology, the change of demographics, and ultimately how we're going to reshape the future of international security. I'm really excited to be able to participate in this event and really excited about all the innovations that are happening just beyond these curtains. Thank you very much for your time and welcome your thoughts. If you get a chance to chat after this, I'd love to hear your thoughts on Cyberspace 2025 and the things that are keeping you up at night. Thanks very much.